Testing, testing. I like doing that. Okay, welcome everyone. So welcome everyone to one of our first in-person lectures in a very long time. My name is Terry Peters. I'll be the host of the evening and I'm co-chair of the Department of Architectural Science lecture committee along with Professor Will Galloway here. I'd like to welcome everyone here in person and also to our live stream attendees. This lecture series is designed to be a learning opportunity for our students and to connect with the wider architecture community. Our lecture committee of students and faculty decided on our speakers this year to provide opportunities to engage with issues facing our profession and the building industry. This lecture is the first in our lecture series for 2022-2023 and is part of the closing event to the Cornelia Hahn Oberlander Genus Loci exhibition, currently on show in the Paul H. Cocker Gallery just next door, here in our building. So the exhibition closes tomorrow, so it's your last chance to see it tonight and tomorrow during the day. The Cornelia Hahn Oberlander Genus Loci is organized as part of the Poole Center of Design by the Art Gallery of Alberta and the West Vancouver Art Museum. It's curated by Amory Calvelli and Dr. Hilary Letwin. Both the exhibition and tonight's lecture are made possible with contributions from the Cornelia Hahn Oberlander Funds, Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, and funded by the Government of Canada with additional support for tonight's lecture from the Ontario Association of Architects and the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. I will now share our land acknowledgement. Toronto Metropolitan University sits on lands that are now known as Toronto, which are inhabited for millennia by many Indigenous nations and peoples. It is our tradition to begin our meetings with a land acknowledgement, which not only recognizes the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples in our area, but is also a reminder that we are all accountable to these relationships. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share this territory and to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers have been welcomed into this treaty in the spirit of friendship and respect. It is in this spirit and on behalf of the university, our department, and all in architectural science faculty, I welcome you tonight. Will?
Hello, so my name is Will Galloway, and I'm working with Terry. I'm co-chair of the DAS lecture committee this year. So tonight, as you can see in front of us, we have the man himself, Joseph Fry, who's going to be giving a lecture. He's an inspiring landscape architect and founding principal of Hapa Collaborative from Vancouver in Canada. First of all, thank you for coming. We're going to have more introduction, but I'm going to pass that on to, who's going to do that? Navneet, but give me one just quick moment. Just a few logistics. If you have any questions, the lecture is going to be about 45 or 50 minutes long. If you have a question, can you keep it for yourself and just sort of hold it in until after the lecture, and then we'll go around and we have time to ask and answer questions. So me and Stefano, who hopefully is also around somewhere, we'll have microphones and your questions will be answered. So just be sure not to forget your amazing questions while you're hearing the lecture. Okay, so let me pass this off to Navneet.
Hi, I'm Navneet, and I would just like to take a minute and introduce our speaker for the evening, Joseph Fry, who is a landscape architect and founding principal of Hapa Collaborative. He's a vocal advocate of Vancouver's public realm and the role of landscape architecture. He's dedicated to deepening our collective understanding and investment in civil placemaking. His professional offices have included the chair of Frischman Advisory Design Panel, member of the Vancouver Advisory Urban Design Panel, director of the BC Society Landscape of Architects, and adjunct professor with the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at the University of British Columbia. Joe is a coach, parent, a volunteer, and a committed participant in our city's discussion about design and the public realm. His work spans the full spectrum of the profession, including large-scale master planning, landscape urbanism, commemorative landscapes, detailed design, and construction supervision. This evening, Joe will review the work that his practice has been involved in over 14 years and discuss how Hapa has interacted with the work of the mid-century modernists in Vancouver, specifically Cornelia Oberlander's signature cities, including the Square at Vancouver Art Gallery and the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia. In his talk, he will also examine how landscape architecture as a profession has evolved. In this age of reconciliation, to be more multiculturally literate, to be a voice for stories who would be otherwise unheard. Thank you, and let's give a warm welcome to Joseph Fry.
Can you guys hear me okay through this mic here? Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction, and Naveed, appreciate that, and thank you guys for welcoming me to the traditional territory of so many important First Nations, and coming from Vancouver, where we live and work on the traditional territory of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and I will touch a little bit on some of the work that we've been doing in Vancouver area with First Nations, and being here at Ryerson, pardon me, Toronto Metropolitan. It's a habit difficult to break, I'm sure, but it's very timely as given the name change with your own institution. Also timely because my son, I don't think here, even though I think the free pizza would have helped, but he's in his first year of graphic design studies, and he's living just down the street here, so good timing. So I appreciate the invitation and the chance to talk with you guys in person, which we haven't done in a while. And I know Tara mentioned too previously in passing that most of you are in the architecture profession, and that landscape architecture might be a little bit of nuanced, something that might be new to you. And I'll try to kind of frame it in that way. As landscape architecture practice, we consider ourselves to be urbanists first. We think about the big picture, we think about the kind of quality of the spaces as they fit in with built form, as we fit in with streets and laneways and pathways. And it's not so much the decorative art of landscape architecture as it's come to be defined in the last couple of decades. It's really something about thinking about the urban realm in its entirety. And so we often interact with architects very intimately, with urban designers, urban planners, interior designers, etc. Hapa, the name, by the way, means many things, but it's Hapa is a Japanese, actually Hawaiian Japanese term that means half, or mixed, or hybrid. So someone who's part native Hawaiian and part Japanese is where it originated from. But it's also, there's an older Japanese term that means leaf. It can be defined, you spell it slightly differently in kanji, it spells leaf. But my favorite is that it's like a disruption. This is an ancient Japanese term that means this kind of disruption, and in doing that, it kind of clears the ground for something new. Which is a definition I like the best, actually, out of all of them. And there's a great film by Jeff Sheba Stearns, who's half Japanese like I am, called One Big Hapa Family, and I encourage you guys to read it or to watch it. I grew up in Northern Ontario, so I went to Guelph as well, so not too far from here. But I would like to say that the landscapes of Northern Ontario, if you actually walk through the atrium at Brookfield Place right now, there's a great little exhibit of some of the paintings of Lauren Harris and the Group of Seven. This is visible from my hometown, Marathon. I don't know if anyone's been there or driven through there. But to me, I think the landscapes of Northern Ontario really probably prompted me to get into this field of landscape architecture just by virtue of where I was living. I've had a lot of different mentors and influences in my career. Bob Marasse is someone I worked with in Seattle. Graduated from Guelph, went out to Vancouver. Dave Mitchell and Pat Campbell were my first bosses. I went to Seattle. I worked with Bob Marasse, who's a landscape architect who's Japanese American, and he did these beautiful memorials of the Japanese American experience during World War II, and I'll touch on that here. Chris Phillips from PF Studio, they have an office here in Toronto, pardon me, and then I started my own practice. But one of the mentors to all of us in the profession of landscape architecture is mentioned, you have a couple days to check out her work. Full summary of a lot of the work that she's done, both in play, residential work. It actually doesn't really feature some of the projects I'll talk about here today, but Order of Canada recipient. She worked until the age of 99 when she passed away a couple years ago. An incredible influence on all of us. And I'll tell you a brief story about her. When I was working with PFS, I spent 8 years with Chris, and we were working on a project that Cornelia had originally designed, and Chris had been hired to do some modifications to. And I was working on that project, and Chris had to run off to a meeting, and she pulled me aside and said, I really don't like what Chris is doing on this project. And I'd like to encourage you to start your own practice, and you could take this project and do exactly what you're doing, because I like what you're talking about. And she did this with a smile on her face. It's kind of, she was a bit of she liked to stir the pot, I think. And I think that's fundamentally what made her such a good designer. Then we were working on the Vancouver Art Gallery, which was one of her projects. And Sarah in our office, Sarah Siegel, who knew Cornelia as a child, it's why she got into the practice, actually, of landscape architecture. We started work on this plaza that Cornelia had started, and she pulled Sarah. I found this out afterwards. She pulled Sarah aside and said, I really don't like what Joe's doing on this project, and I think you should start your own practice, and you can do what you're talking about. So and again, the same smile that you see here is how she shares it. But I think if there's one thing that Cornelia has always been, is an amazing researcher. She knew her plant material like almost prescriptively. I heard stories where Schmidt nurseries out of Wisconsin, they supply almost a lot of the trees. They grow a lot of the trees in North America. She would call Thomas at Schmidt Nursery every week to find out what's in the nursery, what's growing, what works. A red maple that was planted 20 years ago is hybridized and can provide another species that can do a much better job in current times. So she was relentlessly dedicated to the research of plant material, paving materials, all of the materials that we have available to us as landscape architects. And we certainly benefited from that in our own practice. So I'm going to tell a story about maybe four or five projects. The first of which is back in 2013. We had been it started Hapa in 2008, really just starting. And we got involved with this project that Nick Milkovich, who we share an office space with. Nick Milkovich is a disciple, worked for Arthur Erickson for many years. In fact, Nick, I'm going to share the cursor. You guys can see that? Okay, perfect. So Nick did a lot of this is the courthouse in Robson Square. Robson Square is 3 blocks of the center of Vancouver. Nick did a lot of the detailed design of the courthouse, and actually did some of the model making back in the 70s. We were asked by the City of Vancouver to look at the North Plaza of the old courthouse, the old Vancouver courthouse, which is now the Vancouver Art Gallery. And this is like the unfinished piece of this 3 blocks of urban space in the City of Vancouver. And again, we're 3 years into this, right? Like, we're just fairly new, and we were just interested in pursuing this, and we communicated with Nick, we got our team together, and we won the job. It's an amazing space, historically speaking, when you think of it from even just post-colonial scenario. This is the old Hotel Vancouver in the back of the image. This is the Duke of Connaught in front of the actual courthouse here, which had just been built, 1912. This is 100 years ago. And this is the space as it functioned back then. Horse-drawn carriages collecting around the space. And it's always been a space that has kind of functioned as this primary gathering place, but the quality and the character of it has evolved and changed over time. So previously a lawn with these kind of very decorative Beaux-Arts style of formal response to this Beaux-Arts building. Then the lawn started to fail. They started to pave over this space and create more of a formal relationship to the front door. The front door actually turned into the back door when the Vancouver Art Gallery joined, and so this front door is no longer used as the access to the building. This fountain in the middle here is a 1967 ceremonial fountain that was built to actually prevent collection of people in the space. The Socrate government at the time didn't like the protests that were going on in here, so they built this fountain. I'll tell a bit of a story about that too. But it's always been a place where demonstration has happened, regardless, and it's been always been that played that role. Whether it's small gatherings like the gay rights movement back in the 60s, or this is Occupy on the left, Occupy movement back in 2011, the Jazz Festival. Notice the fountain not really doing its job of deterring people, but still providing a little. Can you guys guess what this is? This is 420. 420 marijuana advocacy celebration. I mean, this is like 50,000 people, closing down all the streets. So it's always kind of functioned in this way. But it's taken a little bit of abuse, and Lance Spirulowitz, who worked on our design team, he described it in a very apt way of it's been largely forgotten. He got this kind of death by benign neglect. No one really is paying attention to it. This bark mulch that they lay down here is actually on top of a vault that houses about $100 million worth of art. So it's the reason why it's kind of treated this way is because it's just really not safe from a waterproofing perspective. So, which is partly the reason why we got involved in this project. It was about repairing the roof of that vault. So we started getting involved, and I want to say the first thing that we did with this project is we had about a $3 million budget to replace the waterproofing on top of the vault below and do all the reparation, landscape work on top. And we said that's not enough money. You need more. So we actually went on a tour. We took 3 days and we went to 3 different cities. We went to Portland, San Francisco, and LA, and we met with Doug Macy up in the upper left, who did Pioneer Square, a beautiful space if you guys have been there. We met with the the operators of Union Square. She does the work there. This is Alex Rios, who did Grand Park in Los Angeles. And we just did a lot of fact-finding and research. And we did almost like an audit of our space based on a number of factors. Its delight or comfort or, just its relationship to its context. And we scored our site against these other sites and just did a bit of a comparison. The most important comparison we did, though, was the budget. So we had to build a case for this. And as landscape architects, I'll say this to you as architects, we are often challenged by budget. And Cornelia will be the first to admit to that through the work that she did. We showed that this renovation, not just the actual first construction of Pioneer Square, was $10 million, about $3,300 a square meter. They also have an operating budget of $2 million, probably more now, to program the space. They have 350 events in this space every year. Sometimes they go on at the same time. And it's an amazing example of an urban living room, probably the best example of an urban living room that I can think of in North America. Half a block away, Director Park, designed by Laurie Olin, about $2,000 a square meter, and an operating budget of about $250,000, and City of Portland operates this. They actually call it their outdoor recreation center. It's like a recreation center with no roof, and they treat it that way. They program it and manage it in much the same way, even though everyone's welcome. This is Union Square, San Francisco, $2,500 a square meter and an operational budget of $400. This is actually run by almost like a mall. It's they have a BOD, they call it, which helps but operate, maintain, and program this space. So unlike Pioneer Square, if someone's skateboarding through here, someone will be there to say, nope, pick that up, and you're not allowed to skateboard. So it's treated in a kind of hybrid of public-private, which was very odd, very American actually, but a little odd. This is what we showed our client, is that we were about a quarter of the budget that we really needed to build this in a proper way. And this is also including the waterproofing work that we had to do underneath the bark mulch that you see here. And our operating budget, $0. They had no idea as to how they wanted to program this. We've since we've done our work, they developed a plan, and we're participating in that plan, and I hope to continue to be as we move forward. I hope sorry, that cursor, let me hit, should work. There we go. So we did a little bit of a process diagram to show what are sort of the guiding principles of this site, and what are the things that we really wanted to accomplish. It really was an idea of synthesizing a whole bunch of different ideas and the role that this space has to play. This response to an historic forum, but also thinking of it as the center of the city, but in the way that we designed it, thinking of it as a kind of an interior room, an inside room, but also this outside room, which is framed by the Hotel Vancouver and the Hotel Georgia and the TD Tower, etc. And so we really looked at the edges of the space. And if you guys read Christopher Alexander, I hope you do, Pattern Language, seminal text, you should all have a copy of it. If the edge is not built, if the edge is built with some consideration, then the space itself will fail. And I think that's a principle that we apply to a lot of our projects, creating a good, strong edge that acts as a threshold but a place for lingering, and allowing the middle to be highly flexible and usable. So that's what we did. And Matthew Sewells, who's a prof at UBC actually, was involved in our design team, and he described the edges that we were trying to accomplish here. We couldn't build on top of the vault with trees, so we built a pavilion. We called it the Bus Plus. It's a bus stop, but also weather protection. We pre-wired and pre-plumbed it for a future cafe for food service. We hope it will happen in the future. It's a lantern for the space. It's really well lit and acts as a bit of a draw and attractant for activity. But we couldn't plant trees. We were able to extend the trees along the edge of the Hotel Vancouver and along Georgia Street, and also along, this is Howe, with the side garden as well. So what we're doing is providing what Matthew called the social confetti, right? The little places, benches and edges and shade and weather protection that allow the middle of the space to really be highly functional and flexible. The Vancouver, the Vancouver Jazz Festival programs this space. The Taiwanese Jazz Festival programs this space. The movie guys in Vancouver, they fill this space with their with every possible tractor and trailer. So while there is no operational budget, it is highly used by all of these different people. We sampled a lot of the materials of the Hotel Vancouver, some of the pink granite that you see in some of the buildings around there, pinkish hue to them. Arthur Erickson even talked about using more vivid colors or brighter colors in this Vancouver climate. He always liked using hints of pink. And so we actually incorporated that into our paving pattern. This is some drawings that Sarah developed. I can tell you a bit of a story about how we arrived at this pattern, but it's really based on the golden section, which is the front of the building. Again, something I urge you guys to read about. But the scale and space of the facade and the relationship of this plaza to the facade is all based on that proportion. And our paving was kind of derived from that. But we couldn't afford a water feature, so we were like, okay, why don't we treat the paving? We know it's going to have a certain color, but when it's wet, there's certain things that'll pop out in the middle of our rainy Vancouver climate. So we used a combination of concrete and pink granite, which is from Princeton, BC. Very unique whitish pink granite that creates this pattern. Cornelia didn't necessarily approve of our paving pattern, but I think her influence, like we were certainly trying to pay attention to how we could create this inner sort of space, but bring the materiality of the paving, the concrete around the edges of this of the center area rug, I'd call it. And we had some great discussions around it. And but where she actually had the most influences in our tree planting, this is a section through the edge on Hornby, and it shows a stormwater management strategy. So that entire plaza slopes at 3% towards one edge of the plaza, and we pick up all that water and we put it in the ground, and it goes into this exfiltration zone under the groupings of trees here. So you can see the pipes that kind of feed this area. So when it rains, this becomes saturated with rainwater, and then it overflows to the storm that sits out here in the street. And as a result, we've got this passive irrigation for these trees. And Cornelia had recommended not red maple that she had planted along Hornby. If you guys have been in Vancouver, the double row of red maple along Hornby, beautiful, beautiful, the best streetscape in Vancouver. We continued that double row, same 5.5 meter on center spacing, but the species we chose was based on her recommendations for red point, red maple. And it's interesting how the 3 blocks of Robson now become a bit of an urban laboratory for how trees perform based on their species selection, the ground condition that you create for them, and the fact that we're able to irrigate these passively. They're right now they're beginning to turn red, and they are fantastic. They look great. So we really, and she also recommended some other species as well. In terms of materials for seeding, we love using wood, natural wood, but when we use wood, we use it in a big, robust, thick way. Our wood on the BC coast and in Canada in general is a little softer. We can't use tropical hardwood. We prefer not to. So when we use the wood, we 10 inches, 12 inches thick. I've just met with the mill in Squamish, north of Vancouver. This is where this wood comes from, up in the Pemberton Valley. Sustainably harvested, second growth forest, fir, cedar, and hemlock. And we try to make the connections as simple as possible. So it's just a single ready rod through. We did some interesting sort of chamfered pieces here that they milled. And this is actually, some of these materials came from, they were supposed to be used for hydro poles. We ended up using them for decking. So trying to be adaptive to all of our scenarios. Wood is also, more comfortable to sit on. We just, if it does get damaged or needs repair, it's a really easy, simple way to replace it. Some of the other more intimate, bike deterrents or skateboard deterrents if necessary. This bench here is 30 meters long. It's taller in one end and shorter in the other, so it accommodates different heights, different ranges. And this is this kind of social confetti that Matthew was talking about, creating a little bit of the everyday conditions at the edge of the site. If you want, it doesn't matter where you live. If it's cold out, you'll sit in the sun. If it's warm out, you'll sit in the shade. And that's an irrefutable truth. Doesn't matter where you live. And so I think we're trying to accommodate that in this space. What that allows for is the middle of the space to be super flexible. So we had first Truth and Reconciliation Day was here. We had Greta Thunberg. Where is she? She's bottom right. You can see her there behind one of the representatives from Musqueam. Some protests, climate strike was here, and all of the other more celebratory events. This space can fit about 5,000 to 6,000 people, and that's our intention there, is to really clear the deck to allow this immense kind of flexibility. I was actually driving past it earlier this summer, and there were 3 events going on at the same time. There was people protesting their government in Colombia. There was the anti-loggers over in another corner, and then the Jesus Saves people with their placards, all going on at the same time. It's chaos, and it's what makes these spaces so usable, flexible, desirable. And I just thought that was awesome. On the other side of the art gallery, So the art gallery is to the, pardon me, the North Plaza is up here, and this is the annex. So Robson Square, way back in the 70s, Robson Street was meant to be pedestrian only. Arthur and Cornelia wanted this to be just pedestrian. They actually wanted to have trams go through here, buses, etc. And if you've been to Vancouver, you'll know that this is below the street. Actually, I found out this while we were working on the project, they actually anticipated the SkyTrain to go underground here and that this would be the station. You can kind of flow up and out. Never happened. So this subterranean space down below has always been a little bit of a underutilized, let's say, but there's a skating rink underneath these domes. So we did a little bit of test cases here, and we started to program this for pedestrian use, and we were able to actually convert this to a fully pedestrianized space with the annex on the right-hand side here and Cornelia's landscape mound. One of the first spaces I ever went to in Vancouver, standing on the top of this mound surrounded by vegetation looking up at the skyline of the city you could be in this kind of wild environment in the middle of the city. It was a really successful idea of that. But we also like the idea of lining the edge of that mound with more seating in the shade, taking away the asphalt and the curbs, and just reapplying the same paving that she had developed with Arthur through the middle. This top of this mast, by the way, at Friday at 5 o'clock, there's the first 7 notes of Loverboy's song, Working for the Weekend, is broadcast from the top of this. So yeah, every day at 5 o'clock on Friday. So great public art piece. So this is the original planting plan that Cornelia had developed. A lot of non-native material. There's a lot of ivy that's still remnant there. It's tough to get rid of. A lot of decorative rhododendrons, etc. Japanese maples. Brianna in our office developed a planting plan that, because we had to remove a lot of this material, looked at rewilding this mound in accordance with some of the more principles that Cornelia had really wanted to apply to her later work. In fact, I think, I can say later work, I think she was really leading the charge through the 70s, 80s in using plant material that is native to the BC coast or in wherever she was working. And so we were, again, consulted with her. We heard a lot of her opinions on what should work and what couldn't. And we started to apply this to the site. We were able to execute a little bit less than what we show here, but hopefully more in the future. This is, it's interesting how when the asphalt was there, even though it was closed to vehicles, people still walked on the sidewalk. The curb was there. So once we got rid of the curb, all of a sudden, the nature of this space kind of changed. It wasn't linear like a street. It was actually more width and depth to it than I think people perceive it. Just taking away those curbs and allowing these edges to be sittable and occupiable, right? So I'm just amazed at how much it has transformed. People still move through, they still walk through, but the edges are a little bit more inviting and encourage a bit of lingering. We finished the planting a year ago, end of August, and this is all native, Kinnikinick, Salal, etc., all native plants. And then the Truth and Reconciliation protests began. I don't know if you've been in Vancouver lately, but the space is now pretty fully occupied with a kind of an ongoing protest. And this is part of that work. So I hope the plants will survive despite some of these intrusions. So happy to answer a few questions about that. That was a really big project for us, 2013. Move fast forward to about 2018. I mentioned to you I'm part Japanese. My mom's side of the family is Japanese. My dad's side is born in Chatham area here. And my mom was actually, my mom's family was in Vancouver in the 30s. They were moved in 1942 due to the World War II. All Japanese had to be evacuated from the coast. It's kind of a sordid, sorry history here in Canada. It happened in the States as well. But my mom was born in Spokane during the internment years, moved to Ontario and met my dad here. I now live in Steveston, which is where the Japanese fishing community lived at the time of the war. And these are photos from the fleet that was sort of rounded up and confiscated and then actually auctioned off to the highest bidder. This image here on the right is a story of people lining up on the train track to be moved to the interior. We were asked by the Steveston Japanese Cultural Association to develop a memorial, and initially they wanted to build a sculpture that was basically this woman and child here. And they said, well, just do a bronze sculpture, everyone will be happy. And we said, we really think that this deserves a little bit more than just another didactic kind of bronze. And we encouraged them to do something a little different that was more landscape-based. We ended up meeting with over, I'd say, 150 people in the community, young, old, people who are really vocal about, and people who had a personal experience with the internment. And it was a really wonderful opportunity to learn a lot of these stories. But the people in the middle on the bottom here, these women here, probably some in their 70s. There was one who was over 100 years old, and they were teenagers at the time of the internment. And they didn't really want to talk to us. They talked enough about the internment. They, every story you could hear. But they were busy making these little baskets and weavings. And they sell them for about $5 each. Placemats, coasters, trivets, and baskets. And they're made out of salmon can labels. So in wartime, they'd have little scraps of paper, and they would kind of assemble them and make little craft things. So they still do that today. In fact, Kenfico, the company, still prints these salmon can labels just for them. This salmon is long gone, but they print them just for these young ladies here. About 20 of them. And they sell them for about $5 each. We really love this idea that these weavings, and actually the other thing we found out about was these weavings are actually, when you translate it from Japanese, ishi, tatami, ami. Ishi means stone, tatami means like tatami, like paving or surface. Ami means weaving, I believe. Hanako would know best. She's Japanese, she speaks the language. So there's actually a call and response from what they were doing wartime and today, and what we started to apply to this project. And so our main gesture with this project is to really try to find pattern language. Hanako did all of these sketches, these kind of cuts with stone, and we ended up with something on the right here, which is really a use of material, one type of material. It's basalt, native basalt, local basalt, but treated 3 different ways. So smooth sawn finish, a bush hammered finish, and then a flame finish and a sawn finish as well. So just riffing on the patterns that we had seen these women preparing in their weavings. The site itself for the memorial was in the middle of an underutilized lawn adjacent to the tram building. It's an historic recreation of the tram, which is how Japanese families were moved from Steveston. So this idea of coming and going was really locating this memorial, which is largely these boulders here in this field of paving. We also found a couple of trees. They're ume plums, Japanese plums. My grandmother would eat these plums. They're pickled, and good for your tummy, apparently, upset tummy. But they're actually from Wakayama Prefecture in Japan, and Wakayama is where many of the Japanese in Steveston came from. So they flower in about February, March in Vancouver, which is about the time that Japanese people were evacuated from Steveston. So it isn't just a story about leaving, it's about coming back as well, which many of them did. A lot of people wanted a bronze. They were just like, we want something we can touch. So we actually cast a map and cast the names of all of the sites of internment in the side of the stone, these big pieces of granite, and use these bronze buttons so that you can actually touch something. And I think that was quite an important aspect to this, to have something tactile. I'm still pursuing my thesis project at school was actually a commemoration of a site in Northern Ontario where my family was moved as well. So to be continued. Lots of different opportunities to explore that story. I'm going to talk a little bit about Polygon Gallery, and then I'll talk about the Museum of Anthropology, and just want to watch our time here. So we've been working with the city of North Vancouver, which is on the north side of Burrard Inlet, looking at the city of Vancouver. An amazing transformation of their waterfront. If there's one waterfront that I think has worked exceptionally well, it's theirs. They really have figured out the way to program to convert spaces that have been completely inaccessible, waterfront, working waterfront that no one gaining access to. There's still some remnants of it here with the Washington Marine Group and their float, the Coppersmith Building, which is where they do some metal work. Right next to that is the Wallace shipyards, where they cut the pieces of metal that would be used to then weld onto these ships. So completely inaccessible to the public, and now the most dynamic waterfront, public waterfront in Vancouver. Part of this was looking at this site, which was actually cantilevered out over the water. This was all, we built a new cofferdam along this edge, but the original shoreline was back here. The Polygon Gallery is the recreation of a gallery that had been up the hill, funded by the Polygon Homes. Michael O'Dane, who's a very important philanthropist, helped to finance this building, about a $15 million beautiful art gallery. And our components really looking at the space between the gallery and the Coppersmith shop, which is now a restaurant, and the waterfront here, which is a continuation of Spirit Trail, which goes from right across. It's part of the Trans-Canada Trail. So one of the aspects, and the Washington Marine Group guys, the owner, that's his boat right there. It's like a small skyscraper on its side. It's massive. But part of our job here was to really look at creating a space that was putting the building on display, allowing for, again, we talk about mass void, we talk about edges and enclosure. I think it took a lot of confidence in ourselves, not just me, but our team, to think of this space as almost being empty, but that the activation of the space and the use of it by people, by the public, helps to make it come to life. And the references. By the way, Lonsdale is down here. If you're driving down Lonsdale and this is full of water, it's got the skim coat of water, it reflects light the same as Burrard Inlet that you're looking at in the background. So it's kind of mimicking where the original shoreline was. But we also were riffing on Japanese, Zen gardens. We were riffing on sort of natural forms and materiality of beaches and water. This is the effect that we were able to create with this 1/8 of an inch of water over top of this surface of granite. And we serrated the granite, we cut it such that it receives, it actually kind of creates a bit of a moire effect with the water. And I just love how it hits these boulders. These are pieces of granite just up the sound from half sound. And this kind of mirrored effect and almost soothing effect that resulted from a lot of technical studies that we did to get the patterning just right. We actually thought the serration is like a knife, right? Like it's got a uphill side and a lower side. And we thought it should be kind of cascading, like a series of little waterfalls, but actually we turned it the other way around, and it's a series of dams, if you can imagine, these little ridges that stopped the water and pushed it up and over. So we did a mock-up to kind of prove that out. But what I love about it the most is that it's become a playground, almost, a water feature, a performative space, professional dancers, amateur dancers, and a mirror that reflects the sky. It's the same color and texture as the inlet behind you. And yeah, I feel this project has really come to be a success, not because of the design, but because of the activity and the activity and the socialness that it creates. And I think it just sets the building off really nicely. Like, I think Pacow Architects did this building. I can't think of anything they've done here in Toronto, but I'm sure you're all familiar with them. Great architects to work with, but they love their jewel buildings. They're beautiful buildings. And so we had to kind of respect that intention of putting the building on display. We also design the mega bench along the edge of the water. So just for your own, at school here, we were talking about model making earlier. We spent a lot of time figuring out this mega bench. This is about 30 meters long again. It's made out of cedar, 4x6, 4x8 cedar. So again, thick, chunky pieces. And we said, well, what if we could take these kind of wave action, these kind of tidal and wave forms, and build it into this space, or into this edge. We looked at the wave deck here along the harbor, Toronto waterfront precedent, and we looked at a lot of precedents, but we wanted something to be slightly different. And we also wanted to be an edge between the Spirit Trail and the water itself, so people could collect along this edge. We built it in digital model, and then we built, from that digital model, we did a scale model, which you see here. Then we did mock-ups. We worked with a carpenter to actually fabricate all of the different conditions that we were creating along the length of it. We got a cut here and then a fold here, and got some kids to play on it just to test out how they would use it. So yeah, 30 meters long, cedar. It's transitioning from the grade here at about 5.5 meter elevation here to 5 meter elevation here. This grading here looks down to the water. You can see the water through it. This decking actually sits over the water too. One of the complaints we get is when people lose their cell phone through the pieces of the wood, but we put some netting underneath there as well, so just in case you're wondering. My daughter, I'd never get her on that. Anyway, but it's interesting to see how different people use the bench, whether to act as a bit of a backrest, as a place to run along. I've seen BMX bikers running. That's another influence from this, is all these mountains up in the North Shore, the bikers with these amazing wood deck trails. So we had a lot of references to refer to. But it's wonderful to see it in action, and this is actually New Year's Day from the polygon looking down, and just the play of the railing, the light of the railing. Never, I'm going to say that we meant to do it, but the railing shadow kind of follows the same curvature as these benches here. Yeah, just like different people use it in different ways. It's been a real success, and we've had the opportunity to work on some sites adjacent to this as well, at the Shipyards Commons, and which is an outdoor skating rink, covered, but also a big draw and success. I want to talk, this is just a brief little interlude, but I just want to talk about, from landscape architecture perspective, a lot of the work we do is kind of hidden. I've also heard, in particular with some of the projects I showed you earlier, this kind of hidden sort of signifiers, like we can talk about semiotics of, the sign and what it means, right? And I feel that landscape architects are very quiet, reserved, and we don't trumpet our work. But this is just to show that there's a lot going on underneath with the work we do. This is a site in downtown Vancouver where it just looks like a typical streetscape, a lot of different street stairs, edges, patios, planters, etc. But we're working really hard to make the urban forest condition work as a part of the infrastructure. It's not decorative. Trees are not decorative in the urban landscape. They are part of the way that the city works. And they have a function in terms of water uptake, transpiration, evaporation, management of a resource, which, as we all know, is becoming more and more important. This is showing that section that we prepared for another site in Victoria, where we're working with silva cells, soil cells that actually capture and contain water, provide soil volume that is not compressed on, urban trees, particularly in East, in Toronto, etc., really struggle in urban environments. The average street tree lasts maybe 10 years, maybe 10 years. And we need to do a better job as landscape architects for advocate for good soil volume, good water management, right species, the right tree in the right place. And there's a lot of work that goes into that to make that function. It's not just about plunking a tree in the ground and making it work. And you also have to think about all of the utilities that go in here, electrical, gas, power, everything that can sometimes conflict with that. But to me, it's a really important aspect of the work that is somewhat hidden. There's a project near UBC called Menno Hall, which is going to be a mixed use of student housing, rental housing, and a Center for Global Peace Studies. And another thing that I think we try to do is to refer, we are students of our profession. We describe this little landscape as a grotto. So I had the opportunity to travel in Italy, probably 5 years ago, and traveled in through Florence and Venice. And you guys should all be doing that. You should all be traveling and learning from your experiences. But this grotto, the sense of a grotto, in a contemporary sense, that is fronting onto in the back of this image, where the right here is where the Global Peace Studies Amphitheater looks down and into this water feature that is below the street, and is surrounded by these kind of cantilevered forms and span forms, also parking underneath. So it's a really contemporary example of it. But on top of all of that is the operational performance of this water feature. It's not just a decorative, put a bunch of potable water in a pond and recirculate it. We're actually collecting rainwater off of the roofs, putting it in this detention tank here. That detention tank helps to create, it has a bit of surge to it. So when I say surge, additional volume for when it really rains to be able to take the surge off of the stormwater system. It fills up and then is clean, goes through some filtering, and then we allow it to be recirculated in this space. So this is, it's largely rainwater. It will be topped up in times of drought, but it is really functioning as a way of managing a resource that is integrated in the entirety of the building. And we're working with civil to figure out ways to detain more water on the roof here. So using green roofs with a blue horizon, we call it, a little bit of storage on the roof, just underneath the sedums, and a little bit more surge in the pond itself. And Menno, and we've also referring to some stories about the client itself in the base, the grotto itself. Okay, last project is a Museum of Anthropology. Has anyone been here? I hope you guys have all seen it. I would argue Arthur Erickson's most, I like it the best, personally. Robson Square, Simon Fraser, lots of great examples, but this building, I think, is really quite beautiful. Unfortunately, the Great Hall here on the right has just been demolished. A bit of a shock, I'm sure, to some of you, but it is actually seismically never suited for the collection of totems that you see here in the bottom left. In an earthquake event, this would have toppled right on top of each other and would have destroyed all of these things. So for 50 years, this building has kind of been in the state of just kind of waiting for the big one. So Nick Milkovich, again, did the models in Arthur's office in the 70s, is the architect for the rebuilding of the Great Hall. It is currently under construction. They're working through all the glazing, the concrete to match and kind of maintain a relationship to the original building. But they're going to be built on top of an isolation pad. So I'm sure you guys will get into this in your studies here. Seismic isolation, which is base isolation. So when the earth moves, the building moves less. The building still moves, but it'll move less. There's a seismic gap between the new building and the landscape that you see in front here of about 2 feet, just a void space, right? And it's covered with a metal plate. The building moves, and the ground moves, and the building does not. So that's under construction now. As part of the construction, Cornelia's landscape, which includes this pond, has been demolished in order to get access to it. It's been completely removed as well. It is an interesting story and very politically complicated. It's on UBC property. It's run by its own private, the museum itself. It's a landscape and a building together, a really successful example of one that was designed and built in the 70s to mimic a inlet of a North Coast First Nations, the Haida. So this pond is meant to kind of wrap around this mound shape here, pretty high mound, and right here and along this edge, a series of Haida houses, mortuary house, a long house, and totems were placed. This site is on Musqueam traditional territory. Musqueam were combatants with the Haida. The Haida would have war parties that would come down from the Haida Gwaii into the Burrard Inlet, and this site was the place of perspective where Musqueam scouts would be on the lookout for the war parties coming into the strait, and actually act as a scout for all of the other First Nations up the inlet and up the river. The placement of the Haida elements, again by a colonial, post-colonial design team of the, Arthur and Cornelia, has always been a sticking point for Musqueam, and only now with this renovation of the Great Hall and the landscape have we had an opportunity to really correct the narrative. And it's been really challenging. Nick has been at this for 7 years, just going through the political sort of machinations of UBC. UBC has its own, as every learning institution has, come to sense of reconciliation around what that feels like. And it's taken a long time to get there. So enter Hapa Collaborative, and we're trying to reconcile all these things in landscape. This is Cornelia's landscape plan from 2010, another renovation of the landscape. So I should just go back here. This is the original, do you guys hear that? Okay, we're good. This is the original plan that never really got fully executed. The landscape was slashed. The budget got slashed as the building went over budget. This is her renovation from 2010, which looked at integrating more natural plants, native local plants. Again, slashed. The project never actually was fully realized. And so we're now in 2022 working with Musqueam as our client, along with the Museum of Anthropology, to develop a new narrative for the site. And it takes time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of negotiation and stepping forward, but then stepping back a little as well. And we tried to develop a series of sketches that shows that what we heard, essentially. And I feel that consultation process, again, as designers, it doesn't matter if you're architects or landscape architects, you really have to have big ears. You have to listen. And you have to repeat what gets said. And over the course of what are now probably 8 or 9 meetings with Musqueam, you need to sort of reiterate what was said and heard. But at the same time, as designers, we are experts, right? We might not be experts in certain ethnobotanical things or traditional knowledge, but we bring a certain expertise to the table. And you need to be willing to put your work out and for it to be criticized, which we have experienced. But I think just as a message to all of you guys as young designers, you have to put your work out there and subject it to the critique both at school and in the working world. What we ended up with is a scheme that looked at all of the site as a set of gardens. Now, when we talk about landscapes, a lot of people assume that these are naturalized landscapes, the forest, the meadow, this aquatic, this water garden. In fact, Musqueam cultivate these landscapes. They forage in these landscapes. They modify these landscapes such that they're not fully natural. They are influenced by First Nations use of these spaces. My favorite story is the meadow garden here. Yeah, Camas. Sorry, where's my pointer? Bottom left here. Camassia quamash is a food. It's like a potato. It's a little tuber. It's about the size of your finger. It grows in meadows, hairy oak meadows. It is cultivated by First Nations. They actually will burn, prescribe burn, essentially, these meadows to clear out some of the undesirable plants. And then they will dig in the ground to cultivate these tubers to grow for the next growing season. And they come out in the spring with this purple flower, and they'll dig them out of the ground in the fall, and they will steam them. They'll light a fire, warm up these rocks, put the tubers on top, put seaweed on top of that, and steam them, essentially. And they taste like a potato, apparently. So I guess the point we're trying to make here is that this garden tradition we're trying to reinterpret what that actually means, in from an Indigenous perspective, and figure out ways to satisfy a lot of the cultural work and uses of the land that become part of the narrative for the museum itself, right? Like the museum wants to bring people out into this space and help them learn. So now, just today, even this morning, we're going through a plant audit, making sure that the plant selections are appropriate, that they are truly native, which is some of the challenges that Cornelia had when she did her landscape renovation in 2010. We didn't have native plants. We didn't have the same proliferation of nurseries that grow and create the materials we need that are demanded now. So now we're working with seed suppliers to get truly native seed for the meadows, et cetera. And some modifications we're actually making to the water. Cornelia didn't, sorry for the graphic clarity, I just grabbed this off of her presentation, but this is from just this earlier today. But Cornelia didn't want plants in the water. She actually wanted the reflective surface of the water to be, and the line between the terrestrial landscape and the water landscape to be really, really clear. In our discussion with Musqueam, by the way, the name, at least my understanding, people of the rivergrass, there's a plant that is the origin story of their name. And so we're now looking at integrating aquatic plants into the pond and blurring that line between terrestrial, riparian, and aquatic planting. And we've also started to think about not just plant material, but the species, birds, insects, amphibians that are all inhabiting these spaces too, as First Nations would as well. We've been working very closely with Vanessa Campbell. She's the chief linguist with Musqueam. It's a language that is maybe 30 people speak fluently, maybe less. This knowledge is very precious when we talk about plant names and nomenclature. There are some plants that they don't want to share with us. There are plants that there's lost knowledge. They don't know what the name is of the plant. But we're trying to catalog this on behalf of the entire university and start applying this with some, some thoughtfulness, make sure that it's the right plant in the right place. Larry Grant, I hope I hope you guys, again, there's learning is not just about design, it's about understanding cultural stories. Larry Grant, who's an elder with Musqueam, there's a documentary about him on CBC. I think it's on CBC Gem, if you Google it. Larry Grant is an elder. He's in his 80s, maybe 90s. He's part Musqueam and part Chinese. I didn't know that at the beginning of the story. So we learn a little bit about my story, his story, and I love his perspective on how we need to move forward on projects like this. He calls it two-eyed seeing. I don't know if you've heard this phrase, but he uses it to describe the way forward is understanding science and technology and the influence of Western culture and in our thinking, and overlaying it with more traditional knowledge of First Nations. And what results from that is something completely new. And so I'm hopeful that our process here, whether it's thinking about little social spaces within the forest, these are one of several sketches that we prepared for this site to think about how the museum program can extend out. And not necessarily be didactic. What I mean by that is a bunch of plaques in the site describing what you're seeing, but to actually just be immersed in the space and learn by experiencing it. So this is one of our first sketches, showing some modifications, showing how the forest garden, which is kind of underutilized right now, becomes a trail through. We're proposing that we introduce a rivulet here that connects to not an inlet, not a Haida inlet, but an estuary. So thinking of it in a river, the sense of a river. So the same forms, the same terrain, it's actually being maintained, but we're correcting the narrative, as we like to say. We're looking at some modifications to the front as well. So it's really about creating a vision, and the first part of that vision will be adapting this as part of the reconstruction work for the Great Hall. So stay tuned. It's going to be under construction. If any of you are in Vancouver, I encourage you to visit UBC and see how you can actually walk around the site. I'm hopeful that this planting will happen in probably the fall next year, but we'll see. So that's all I wanted to show you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. But thank you for your time.
Thank you. That's great. Hello? Do you want to do this next? So now's the time for questions. We have enough time to ask quite a few questions, actually. So who's first? You want to raise your hand? There must be so many questions. You want to use this right in here?
Do you believe the use of texture and maybe design is important in like forest space when designing the ground?
Yeah, I guess you're referring to some of the paving patterns. I think patterning, use of texture, it's really one of our tools in our toolkit for creating and I think the pattern that we used at the Vancouver Art Gallery, that plaza in particular, is a lot of studies that went into that look at what it feels like, not just walking on top of this, like under your shoes. What does it look like from 20 stories up, and what kind of scale? So we tried to create we tried to create a pattern that was responsive to a number of different scales, and sometimes it can be really subtle. Sometimes it's really it has to be big and bold depending on where you're at. But I think that's very similar in architecture, in thinking of materials for surfaces that you're walking on and what you're looking at. I got something going on. But yeah, it's very important. And it's also thinking about the materials that you're patterning with, right? The resiliency of them. Well, didn't show you, but one of the things we looked at with the Museum of Anthropology is a lot of gravel surfaces that the oral acoustics of walking on gravel is very different than something that you're rolling on like asphalt. And that's something Cornelia was very attentive to in a lot of her projects too. So thinking of that, from in the work that you guys will do is just the reflective acoustic quality of materials for sure. Yeah.
All right. Oh. Sorry.
Hello. Yeah, I would like to know if there's like any tip that you can give for developing urban scapes that are considering the change on the seasons, like considering that we have like that dramatic changes here in Canada, how these spaces are gonna be like dwell on the different seasons and offering kind of like activities to like the people transiting or populating these spaces.
Hello?
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Might have to take this off. But so you're asking about how to accommodate a range of change throughout the 4 seasons of in a Canadian climate. Yeah. It's funny in Vancouver, we're often if we work in Calgary or back east here, we're often accused of not understanding what a winter is. But I can tell you, growing up in Northern Ontario, I sincerely do. And I think we. We're working on a project in Edmonton right now where Edmonton considers it itself a winter city, right? And there's great examples of how to integrate public space and skating trails and outdoor surfaces that are comfortable. And, thinking about microclimate is a big aspect of the work we do. Again, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. If you're cold, you want to sit in the sun. So thinking of how to capture sort of latent qualities of the space, tree selection, coniferous trees on the north side of the building where maybe it's buffeting it or protecting it from winter winds, but on the south, you might want to have a deciduous tree that drops its leaves in the winter and allows the building to be warm passively, but provides shade in the summer. So these are things that you guys will consider in the work you do, but I think as landscape architects, we really want to work, collaboratively in our design teams to figure out these things. We maybe you'll have a chance to do this, but in Guelph, there's one of the only laboratories in the North America that does wind studies. It's a wind tank. They can probably do it all digitally now, but I remember going to this tank. It was a water tank. They build small models of these buildings to show where snow would drift or where winds would accelerate based on the design of the building. And landscape has a role to play in that. Like a snow fence is designed with 50-50 porosity to drop snow out of the wind and it deposits behind it. So we think of landscape in a similar way. A tree can do that same role. So yeah, we think about it a lot. And it's something that as architects you need to consider in your work as well. One there, okay.
I'll go on this.
Why did I decide to be a landscape architect? As I mentioned, I grew up in North Shore of Lake Superior. It's where the boreal forest comes to meet the Canadian Shield, to meet the Great Lakes. I'm sure that had some role to play in it. I remember wanting to study architecture. I think I actually applied to Ryerson at the time, U of T, Guelph, and UBC. But I decided on landscape in part. My dad was also a forester, so I think there's this kind of natural progression from one profession to the other. So I joked with him often, like he cuts down all the trees and I plant them all. But I think he would argue that. But I think that's really largely the decision. But I think there's a kind of open-endedness to it. Architecture, engineering is a little bit more finite and a little bit more precise. I'm not precise at all. I love the kind of looseness that we're able to work with, like building systems and glazing and waterproofing, all that kind of stuff are not my bag. But I do feel that we can get into that kind of detail. That water feature, for example, and the way that we designed that was very precise. So yeah, I kind of like the fluidity of it and flexibility of it. Yeah.
All right, we have another question over here.
You are sort of working with a lot of sites that have cultural, historical context behind them. Where does the process begin of incorporating that history and culture into these projects? Where does that sort of start?
That's a great question. Lots of research, lots of digging in. And let me say too, like we have maybe 30, 40 projects a year, okay? Not every project's the same, okay? I'm showing you a few sort of more important projects. Not every project deserves the same amount of research and commitment and investigation, but MOA does, you know? And so we do a lot of research to literally dig in the ground. You know, you're trying to find as much information that can spark something. And a lot of the research has to go back even further now, and it's working with our Indigenous partners on projects where that's important to really understand what these sites, their significance culturally, but also just the attitude, the approach that we want to take to it. And I think layering that with, you know, post-colonial stories is just as important. And we're working on a site right now in Vancouver, downtown East Side, where it's the site of, it used to be called the place where big maples grow. You could see these maples from the water. It's in the downtown East Side. And we're looking at ways of integrating that name, that story, along with all of the names of the shopkeepers that came, you know, from 1885 onwards, into this sort of mosaic. We call it a scroll or a historic mosaic, and try to do that in a clever way. It's challenging, but I mean, we wouldn't know that unless we did the research. You know, so you got to dig in. We use museum and archives all the time. We walk the site all the time. You have to do that. You can't just, every site has something to offer. Some are more important to do that than others. Yeah.
Do we have another question?
Did you say contrast with the environment? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important principle to, I would say, you know, Vancouver is a bit of a known for its mid-century modern architecture, right? Like Robson Square, and great examples of it. And I would say that idea of contrast and complement is on display with Robson Square, right? This little mound, this hillock, supposed to represent nature surrounded by Arthur's buildings. And that play between the two is really, it emphasizes, it strengthens both, right? It strengthens a kind of architectural form and makes the garden even more special. So I'd say that we try to do that. And, you know, I would say that with the water feature in front of the the Polygon Gallery, like that's really just about this kind of eruption of landform or rock out of a plain, right? That idea of contrast, I think, is really at play there too. I think we try to be as bold as we can, right? Like I feel like we can get lost in the details and the colors and the selection of material, but I think sometimes you just got to hang on to one big idea and make sure that that's carried through despite challenges, whether it's political pressure or budget or differences of opinion. There's always one big idea you try to hang on to and hang on for dear life as much as you can.
Did we have a hand over here?
Hi. So you talked about. I'll just, you mentioned how Cornelia was very particular about her plants. As you move around from site to site, or as you move across Canada, what's your time is going to be a lot different. How do you go about getting someone who knows about kind of the horticulture practice? How do you go about
Yeah, learning as much as you can from the people who know more. We're working in Edmonton, we're working in Calgary, we're working in my hometown actually, and we're just starting a project there in Marathon in Northern Ontario, Zone 2B, right? So people in my office are like, well, we know these plants can work, they meet this certain zone, and I can tell, I know that they will not, like it won't, the sumac will not survive on that site. It's because I know, but for the sites that we're kind of coming into, like we really depend on the knowledge of horticulturalists, nursery people, the people that are growing the material. Like we might spec a plant that we love and think it's beautiful and might work, and it's just not available. Like it's just not grown. Like how would we even consider planting it if it's not available to us? So we have to do a lot of research. We have to, as Cornelia did, right? Talk to people, get on the phone, talk to them face to face, go to their nurseries. Like I was in Squamish 2 days ago to work with the guys who actually mill pieces of 12 by 12 fir and to know how they actually fabricate it. I went next door to the stone guys, so I know what's the size and range that we're going to be able to work with. You have to be face to face, touching this stuff, and knowing what it looks like and feels like, and that's how you get to be an expert as much as you can. And it's not just plant material; like it's everything, right? So yeah, yeah. Does that? I don't know if that. Yeah. Thank you.
We have time for a few more questions.
It's nice out, I know.
Thank you. Hi. Oh, wow.
Hi.
Okay. Is there anything that you have in mind, like, if you had more budget for the Vancouver Art Gallery project?
Right.
And, like, has someone ever suggested, like, for people who don't like that fountain, like, taking it away?
The one that was in the middle?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we did take it away.
Oh, you did take it away?
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
In
Okay.
fact, Cornelia, so when we first started that project, that fountain was built in 1967, right? The big, the more formal one. That was built in 1967 by the Socred government, Grace McCarthy, to deter congregation of people in that space. There's a sculpture in the middle, was a sculpture in the middle of it, this big rock. And we saw a plaque when we first started working on the project. It said, this sculpture is built to recognize the 4 founding nations of Vancouver, the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and I can't remember. And as soon as we saw that plaque and we made the client aware of that, it was gone the next day, right? So there's a lot of good reasons to remove it. And Cornelia, actually, she said, I know a beautiful little park in the edges of Vancouver where we can put that sculpture and no one will ever see it. So it's gone. It is gone. To answer your question about what we would do, the Erickson plan actually had a similar approach to what we did in North Van, where it would be a surface that could be flooded, right? Like it could be just a little bit of water on top of it. It acts as a bit of reflecting. but you can take that water away and it can be open for events and celebrations and big activities. If we had the budget, that's what I would do. Yeah, and I guess we kind of did it at the Polygon. Yeah.
So for the Museum of Anthropology, are you guys working on the front of the landscape where you enter through the main entrance? Because I know that you have to, like, from UBC, you walk down a hill and you have to cross the road to get to the museum.
Yes.
So how, like, first of all, are you guys working on the landscaping on the front?
We're looking, yeah, it's an interesting site. First of all, front and back, water side and land side, right?
yeah.
So again, working with Musqueam, their traditional houses would be on the water. That would be the front. But we are working on the first phase of a larger vision. And that vision also includes the Haida pavilions being relocated and in the introduction of a Musqueam longhouse on the property. So our first phase is really just to respond to the requirements of the reconstruction, but our hope is that it's the first of many phases, including the roadside and the parking lot and improvements with the crossing over Marine Drive, etc. So yeah, and you know, landscape projects as Cornelia, 1977, 2010, actually 2002, 2010, she helped to create a series of phases over time. Oh, there's two. Sorry.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, you can always.
I can.
Everyone, please stay. It's just a few more minutes so that we can properly thank our speaker.
I was wondering, I believe you hinted at it very slightly in your presentation, but how do you get rejection when your designs are rejected, or when you're passionate about something and it's not allowed to be built?
How do we deal with rejection when the client doesn't like our work? Sometimes we are somewhat strategic about it, where we don't give. Yeah, it's a good question, actually. We try to be somewhat strategic in what we present to the client. Like we go through a process where there might be 3 or 4 different design options, but we'll only present one. But you know, when we do that exploration, and you guys will experience this as well, is you really just want to build the best case, the best argument, so it's irrefutable at the end of your presentation or when you present the work. It's just you've created an argument like a lawyer would or like an accountant would, that these are the truths of this project. This is why we made these decisions. And if you can create a good rational approach to your work, and we try to be as rational as not airy-fairy, not just a great, it looks good. There's a rationale to it. And if you do that, then most of the time your client will understand that. But when we get rejected, I suppose we always have a few other options to fall back on. Yeah. Yeah. I was at a city council present. There's another thing: is only present what you support. You know, like don't provide options that you're not going to get behind. We were at a council presentation in the city of Langley, and I showed 3 options, and we ended up with 5 options by the end of a 2-hour meeting with council, and it was a hybrid. It was the project almost failed because we left too many things unanswered. Be bold. You as designers, you are the expert. I mean, I hate to say that, but you are. You are hired for giving confidence to a client and the work that you're preparing. So I think that you need to kind of cultivate that in the work that you do, and be prepared for rejection. We all get rejected. Anything else?
Right.
There's maybe one last question.
I had a last one over here.
One here, and then last question will be there.
You mentioned the edge of the Robinson Square having kind of a clear threshold and an unprogrammed or flexible space in the center. Do you see this as a formulation or more of a situational approach? And then I guess my second question would be, how do you personally define an edge?
Right. I'll start with this second question, an edge, right? Like, again, it could be a grade transition. It could be something where it creates a bit of a step up, down. It could be a canopy of trees that you actually have to kind of duck underneath to kind of pass through. Like, I often describe the canopy of trees as like going into a Japanese restaurant where you actually encouraged to bow and kind of enter into the space. That's a threshold, it's an edge. Something you can link, like something comfortable, right? A bench or a wall that you can lean against, something that's in the sun, or actually taking advantage of the aspect, the microclimate that it is, that encourages people to stay, right? An edge is something that encourages lingering. And by doing that, it makes the space in the center a little bit more usable, valuable. Again, going through Italy and visiting, my favorite space in Italy was the Piazza del Campo in Siena. If you guys know the space, it's like Mecca for landscape architects. And it's an amazing edge, like 13 different houses lined up, the houses of Siena, the families of Siena, and these radiating forms into the center of the space. There's nothing in the space except beautiful paving, and that's where the horse races are. The space fills with people in the 2 times in the summer. It's a great example of an amazing edge. Situation. I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I'm not sure if I don't know. Can you repeat the first question?
Yeah, I guess, do you see that as something you can apply to every circumstance, or is it more dependent on the specific project? Because I know the other one you had with Pat Cow, you showed 2 images, one where there were children playing in that kind of splash pad area, and then also ballerinas.
Yeah. I think it, I think it varies. I think it's situational. Yeah, I think it depends on the kind of edges that you're responding to, the built form that you're. A landscape like MOA is not a clearing. Like, it's not a clear. Like, there are some clearings to it, but I think we're also trying to create an environment that you're walking through, a forest. So that's a very different thing than creating an edge. It's about a kind of an enclosure that you're moving through. Yeah. I think if you distill landscape architecture into 2 ideas, one is like a garden with like the walled garden, and another would be like land shaping, like forming landscapes. Like, one thing that landscape architects know better than anyone is how to work with grade, right? Adjusting topography, shaping it. And that's a way of creating edges as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, last question, and then you guys can go. That's a great question. I think of it more in I think, first of all, I think right now in our process with that, we're at more of a macro scale where we're looking at larger garden spaces, meadow, forest, water, and thinking about transition between those 2. Like, so, but I think when we get down into the details of planting design, we'll think about, like, for example, Larry wanted us to think about pollinating species along a path that encourages hummingbirds and butterflies to reside. So red currant is a plant we know attracts both. So we would probably try to utilize that plant in groupings that creates almost a vector, right, for birds and insects to move along. And then something at a lower a level ground cover that complements that and provides habitat for some other species. But also thinking about it from an aesthetic perspective, like creating views through the forest. Ribes are big plants, fern are down here. So it's about creating a sense of variation along that route using the plants. And I think we haven't gotten to that stage yet, but I think planting design and the use of all of these different layers of height, texture, and color we'll certainly get into to create as much variation as we can. Yeah. Yes. Yes. We draw them. We draw them. Yeah, I think drawing is probably the best tool for doing that, to be honest, to begin with, just to show mass and form and texture. Modeling it, I don't see it that as much value, although we have programs like Enscape that we use. It's a digital modeling, rendering program. It's not that good, actually, for landscape. It's great for buildings, but the plant selection is just not really correct. Maybe 5 years from now, it'll get better. But I think drawing it and kind of getting a sense of the texture, like actually doing it yourself, getting a feel for it is more important at this point. And just seeing them side by each, experience. Walking in a garden, seeing other examples of it and what you're seeing next to you is the best way to test it. Great. Thank you, guys. Thanks for sticking around.
On behalf of the student body, faculty, and staff community of the Department of Architectural Science, we would like to thank you, Joey, for sharing your work with us. The 4th projects talked about really expanded our understanding of how landscape architecture largely contributes to the public realm and how it makes an empty outdoor space more dramatic, lively, and active. May it be through integration of specific pavement heights, various vegetation species, and the importance of service being run. Your words this evening have left us with a greater understanding of landscape design and the importance of collaboration across disciplinary design for the public realm.
So yes, thank you again, Joseph, for joining this evening. And on behalf of the Department of Architectural Science, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us here tonight, and thanks to our team here, especially Bridget Dalama, Eileen Serrano, and our 2 technicians, Ivan and Leo, who've been very helpful, and also the student members of our committee. So this was the first in-person lecture that we had in this lecture series. So I hope you'll join us for the next lecture on October 27th, which will be Alfred Waugh from Formline. So reminder, if you wanted to see the gallery exhibition, it's only open for one more day. It closes at the end of the day tomorrow. Thank you very much, everyone.